Hi everyone, my name's Hannah from the National Forest Gardening Scheme. We're a members organisation which exists to advance and promote forest gardening techniques, to support forest gardeners and to advocate for more forest gardens to happen. We organised this series of seminars, which is 8 weeks long, and this seminar is, we're very grateful to have Tomas Remiarz join us to talk to us about guilds. Tomas is an amazing forest gardener with so much experience. He's also the author of Forest Gardening in Practice, which is a great book, and he was recently on Country File, I think. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Tomas, who can introduce himself better and give the part one of this two-part presentation. So thanks a lot, Tomas.
Hello. I am Tomas Remiarz. I've design, make and maintain forest gardens. Been in the game for 25 years and I still haven't got all the answers, but it's something I find has a lot of potential to change the way we interact with the landscape and kind of the way we produce our basic needs. I will do this presentation in two parts. The first one will look at the principles of making guilds, which is the subject today. So looking a bit at the patterns, the ideas behind it. And then in the second part, we will have a look at a few examples and see how they work and how they apply these principles. So with that, I will start sharing my screen. So the idea, as you probably know, has been around in this part of the world for about 30 years. So what we're seeing now is the first generation of forest gardens have been successfully established, and we can learn a lot from that. What we're seeing now is like the second or possibly even third generation of forest gardens that hopefully applies a lot of the lessons that we have learned in the last 25, 30 years, and they're going to be even better. Just let's have a look at what's the ecology behind the concept of guilds is really. So guilds are something that people talk a lot about in forest gardening. Some people say they're absolutely crucial. Some people say I don't really use them. But if we're looking at the underlying concepts, then I think all of us are using those in a lot of different ways. And the key concept here really is diversity. And when we talk about diversity, then very often people may think about plants from different families or different species, so like the biodiversity. But it is actually a much broader concept. I'll just break it down into its different aspects to look at them in a bit more detail. So starting with structural diversity. So if we're looking what's happening above ground in a forest garden, a lot of you will have come across the idea of layers or stacking. And Robert Hart introduced the idea of 7 layers in the forest garden, so tall trees, understory, shrubs, a couple of herb layers, tall herbs and ground cover, and then roots and climbers as well. So and that's the concept he transferred from where he saw forest gardens in the tropics. I think it's a useful concept. But what I've observed is that in a lot of people have that sort of certain forest like 7-layer guild or 7-layer idea that I have to include them here in any way I can. I think it's worth getting away from that and just thinking of the layers more as a palette of options, a selection of options. So as a painter, you will have all colors at your disposal, but you will not necessarily use them all. And in a similar way, we use whatever layers are appropriate or useful in whatever guild we are developing. And in my experience, most guilds in temperate climates, kind of between 3 and 5 layers, work best. And so it's hard to fit in any more. And if you don't fit in that many, then there's often plants, volunteer plants, that will come in and take up some of the other layers. So that's the vertical. And then that is complemented with the horizontal. So what's happening across a site, we can see that as structural diversity as well in terms of patches. So like each guild, like a tree with a few shrubs and some herbs around it, that could be a patch in itself, or a few trees with some understory, that could be a different kind of patch, or like some shrubs and herbs together, that could be a different patch. And then you can have open space, you can have just like some meadow in that, and that is again that can be an ecologically diverse and functionally useful patch within the forest garden. So it's worth thinking about what's growing up, as well as like how we subdividing the space across a site. So that's what's going on above ground. But then we often forget kind of that there is similar diversity structurally going on below ground. And here's an image that just shows some of the different root and spreading patterns that we might encounter in an edible ecosystem. In terms of how we design forest gardens, it's really worth getting to know your plant roots and knowing how they divide space, how they occupy space below ground, because the more effective we can like use the space below ground, the less chance there will be for plants that we get annoyed by or that we don't want to have in the forest garden to take a foothold. So like if there's a dense root layer as well as a dense vegetation layer above ground, those plants will have less of a chance. So I look at structural diversity in 3 ways: vertical, horizontal, and also below ground. Another type of diversity is what we might call functional diversity. And in ecological terms, I mean, there are plants fulfill all sorts of functions. So they can accumulate nutrients, they can provide biomass, they can be a habitat for insects and invertebrates. They can provide food for insects, especially like in terms of nectar, but also some insects will nibble on the leaves, of course, as we know. And then just the function of ground cover itself. You know, that's actually the ground is covered. There's like water can't evaporate so easily. Water can infiltrate better. The soil is protected. So the ground cover itself like is a major important function within perennial guilds. So here's one where we see it's a very small guild of just like 2-3 meters diameter, where we've got artichokes and an apple, a small apple tree in the top layer. So here's like there's a herb and a perennial herb and a tree. So they both form the top layer, and underneath that we've got plants like fennel, and we've got self-seeding plants like poppy. We've got columbines, and then a lot of herbs in the front: sage, lavender, chives, and so on. And you see there's a lot of flowering plants that will invite insects through the season. Plants like artichoke are really good as biomass producers, actually, that can be mulched and fed back to the soil. And as you can see also that there is no open ground visible in this guild during the growing season. So it's really well protected, really well designed. So, and one thing to point out is that we often think that forest gardens have to be all edible, but actually it's important to not just see ourselves as the only species eating from this forest garden. So actually thinking about that support plants that fulfill these ecological functions are as important. And and some of these will be edible, some of these will be useful for us in other ways. But mean, Robert Keurig, one of the pioneers of edible landscaping, his rule of thumb is that about 50% of your edible landscape should be support plants. So, and that's particularly worth bearing in mind when you're designing the ground cover layer. But also you can include nitrogen fixing shrubs and trees, and they will have support functions. Another type of diversity is what happens over time, across time, and we can see that in two ways. We can, of course, think of seasonal cycles. We can also think of succession and how a forest garden system matures from very small trees and shrubs and a lot of light at the beginning for a lot of sun-loving herbs, and then, like in this picture, like how it's gradually over years and decades transforms. Shade becomes more important, sunlight becomes scarcer. Other plants will have the advantage in those conditions. So over time, we have to adapt our system to that ongoing succession, and we can steer that succession by taking out plants, by adding more trees, or by coppicing. So there are ways of managing the light conditions which are key to what's happening during succession. And if we're looking at the seasonal cycles, then it's worth thinking about having flowering plants all time of the season to keep the insects fed and occupied, and then of course also having ground cover that comes up early, ground cover that stays late, and so having that function covered for as long as possible during the season, and then in the winter, of course, we have that mulch layer of dead plant material that will fulfill that function. In this case, we're seeing like a mature forest garden in Wales very early in the season, and you see here a patch of wild garlic, which is one of the great forest garden ground covers that spreads very easily in many places and has, of course, like a lovely, tasty yield. And that uses the early niche of light in the forest garden, where it can grow without having the shade of the canopy above it. By the time the wild garlic has done its flowering and seeding, other plants have come to their own. So like the soft fruit in the middle layer will be flowering, will have flowered, will start fruiting. And amongst the wild garlic, in this case, a lot of nettles will have appeared. And the nettles are a plant that are incredibly well adapted to mature forest garden conditions. They like the shade, they don't mind the shade at all. And they are very good at hoovering up like high amounts of fertility. And as the forest garden builds up fertility over time, so they're quite likely to be successful in the mature stage of a forest garden. Now, nettles have all sorts of uses. So they're edible, they're great insect habitats. They can make other products. They also make excellent fertility in compost or as a liquid feed. So it's a useful forest plant in itself, but we can think about replacing it with other plants that we might want. So that's the mid-season window, the summer window, and then of course in the autumn the top fruit, in this case plums and apples, will provide the yield for us. So looking at those seasonal cycles is both like thinking about like what ecological functions need to be fulfilled at each time, and what yields can we get out, what functions for us does the space have at any particular time of year. So, and then finally, it is worth like coming back to biodiversity, to the like rich diversity of plants. In this case, I showing a planting of mostly hosta, and you can see, that's a great forest garden plant for especially shady conditions. And in this case, you see kind of how many, like hundreds of varieties of hosta are really available. So you can play with the with the varieties, and that can be really good in terms of plant health and different flavors, different nutrient conditions, but then also thinking about growing plants from different families, again, in terms of not giving the pests and the diseases too easy a ride. And then also thinking about the different kingdoms, so like having habitats for animals throughout the food chain, so especially the predatory animals, from insects to songbirds to small mammals. And then also the fungi, who of course are like one of the driving engines of the forest garden in terms of distributing nutrients, processing dead matter, so they are incredibly important. So throughout the 5 kingdoms of life, we want to encourage the appropriate species to thrive in our forest garden. So these are the basic ideas around diversity, structural diversity, diversity in time, functional diversity, and genetic diversity, of course. And so I'm just leaving this up for a moment to give you pause for thought. So think about kind of how those concepts really apply or are already visible in your forest garden, and how you might use them to design, plant, maintain it, and get the maximum benefit both for yourselves and for other species. And that's the end of part 2 of this little presentation. And end of part 1 of this little presentation, sorry. In part 2, we will have a closer look at a few examples of forest garden guilds and how they apply these principles. Thank you very much.